Hello, and welcome to today's webcast, How to Automate Invoice Automation with Office 365 and SharePoint. My name is Brenda, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we begin, we just have a couple housekeeping items. I'm sure most of you are used to GoToWebinar, but if you are new, you will be on mute when you're joining. If you have any problems with your audio, you can exit out of the screen and attempt to rejoin using the GoToWebinar information you received in your registration. Also, I'd like to let you know that this presentation is being recorded. If you have any colleagues or members who couldn't attend today and you'd like to share it with, we will be distributing the recording after the webcast. With that, I'd like to announce our presenter today, Mike Marson. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you so much, Brenda. Thanks for getting everything started, and thank you all for joining us today. So as Brenda mentioned today we are talking about automating invoice, and specifically invoicing coming from the vendors of your organization using Office 365 as conjunction with our EasyAP 365 application, invoice automation application. So today we'll be covering both the use of the Office 365 framework by our application and go into some of the functionality that our application provides to the overall process as well. So I have a few slides just to get us started, and then from there we'll go right into the application and spend most of the time looking at the product and as well as the complementary Office 365 functionality that will be used in conjunction with this. So just a quick slide about how our product fits into this ecosystem of Office 365. And the analogy I like to use is our product is much like a mobile app that resides on either a iPhone or an Android framework, and that we are leveraging all of this functionality that is being provided by that framework itself. So we are over here, we're obviously Dynamic Point, we're providing to this invoice automation process the ERP integration, such things as vendor templates, PO match capability, workflow integration, etc. And then so much is being provided by the rest of this Office 365 framework to us. So our app is deployed on SharePoint, and it is providing us the security, the branding, the document management, the look and feel, of course, flexibility as far as how we present the invoice processing dashboard. We are using Microsoft Flow, now called Power Automate, for the workflow aspect, and it's going to do the review and approval of these invoices. It's going to provide us a framework for integration to other systems, escalations, things of that nature. For mobile upload, if we want to have the capability to upload invoices using a mobile application, we're using Power Apps. And when then it comes to capturing additional details, maybe a new vendor request or vendor onboarding form, we're using the Forms framework. So all of this is coming together to provide this holistic, flexible framework where we could provide a invoice processing application in conjunction with all this framework for a very cost-effective basis, because so much of it is coming already from your subscription with Microsoft. So moving forward. So on this slide, I want to talk a couple things. One is the functionality of the product, and then the second is just talking about the process in general. Invoice automation is typically broken into three major steps of the process. And the first is what you see up here, and that's the submission. We need to receive these invoices, and we could receive them in various fashions. Maybe they're coming in via email, maybe they're coming in via mail, and we need to scan them and obviously make them electronic. Maybe managers are receiving them in the field, and we want to give them the capability of taking a picture of these and uploading them. Maybe we want to have someone make a request using a mobile app to have a vendor invoice paid. Maybe we want to have a portal site where someone could submit the invoice, and then that goes into our workflow. Regardless of this method, all of these are going into this library, or the SharePoint document library for us. So we have all these different types of invoice submission, which is really just provided by Office 365 as well as SharePoint. And really, from our perspective, those are just the beginning of the process, right? That's the first step in receiving this invoice. And all of those, you could use one of those methods, or you could use all of them in conjunction. The second step in this process is once we receive it, it's the processing of these invoices, and that's where it comes into our product. The processing of these invoices can include a lot of things. First and foremost, OCR, submission of that document to OCR for character recognition. It could support the matching of those invoices to purchase orders or allocation of those to line items if there's not a PO or if you're not using purchasing. It could submit workflow as well as the approval of these. So there's all these various factors that come into the processing of this invoice, such things as department assignment that impact accounting elements, the workflow, OCR, et cetera. And that's the second step of the process. The last and final step is the integration. The integration is what brings it into your ERP system. So we support integrations with a lot of various ERP applications. And what we're going to do is pass that invoice over from our SharePoint deployed product to your accounting system for payment. So at that point, it becomes a typical invoice. It could be aged, it could be paid, and all of that is occurring obviously within the financial ERP application. So again, here's just the process in detail. Various invoices coming into the library, submission to OCR into our product, we're leveraging flow, and then lastly, the ERP integration. So just a different way to look at it here, but the various steps of the invoice process that we plan to cover today in the demo. So I think we've done enough slides. Let's go ahead and look directly at how these options work. So what we have here is a Office 365 SharePoint page with various calls to action or features here. So one thing to note, this is deployed to your Office 365 tenant. So if you look at my URL here, our app is deployed to your tenant. So the look and the feel of this, my various calls to action here, I have some sample stock photography. All of this is entirely up to you on how you want to brand this site, including such things as the logos, coloring, etc. So we're obviously matching our branding and laying it out specific to Dynamic Point, but how you want this to look and feel is entirely up to you because it is deployed to your Office 365 tenant. Other options that you could do here, such things as integrated Power BI reports. So here I'm showing such things as my unapproved invoices by vendor total, the vendors that those invoices represent, an aging of unapproved invoices just by days, etc. So this dashboard here is really targeted towards someone in the AP process, someone who's managing this, sort of overkeeping, if you will, or the gatekeeper of the various invoices that are coming into the system and where they reside in the process. And as I mentioned before, this is really a three-step process. And my calls to action here basically follow that three-step process. Here's where the invoices are coming in. So this is a link to a SharePoint document library for those awaiting preliminary approval. Then I have the processing of that where the workflow and such things as OCR is occurring. And then lastly is that integration. So those are the three steps that I introduced earlier, are all being represented by this dashboard. So let's go in detail on the first one, namely the submission options. Okay, so I could drag and drop invoices into this library. We could submit it on email. We have a web form set up. We have a OneDrive app. We can most certainly scan it. Let's start doing a couple of those just to get things kicked off. Probably the most common is the email submission. So here I have an AP automation at dynamicpoint.com inbox set up. And this inbox is actually associated with that incoming library. So by me submitting this invoice here, so I have a sample invoice from Acme Company, I'm going to go ahead and submit it to that inbox, and that inbox is going to be routed to that library. And when it gets routed to the library, I'm going to capture some details such as who sent it and the subject and things like that. But obviously, I'm going to capture that invoice itself because that's what's going to be used for payment, of course. So I'll go ahead and send that. So that's one method, of course. Another option is the concept of like a portal page or a web form to be used for invoice submission. So here we have a web form on our site that I could use for completing some details. In this case, you notice, of course, I'm have some forms here, fields here. I could capture more details from the vendor submitting it. So that gives me a little bit more flexibility in that I could have them fill out data that will ultimately be used for such things as workflow or account assignment. And we'll submit that method. So those are a couple, as I mentioned. It doesn't really matter how I submit it. They're all going to the same place in this process, to a inbound library. I'll show you a few more mobile options. So I'll go ahead and bring my phone over here. So these are received invoices, the same library that ultimately all these are going into. So you can see here I'm getting some new ones in here at the bottom. So these are the invoices that just got submitted. This is using the OneDrive application that's provided by Microsoft, which is available on the Apple and Android stores. I could also submit new invoices directly from this app as well. So this would be something if you have maybe a manager or someone in the field who's receiving these invoices, and we want them to submit it to our inbound received invoices library. So if I create new here, you can see I have an ability to scan it. I have a simple invoice sitting on my desk, so I'll go ahead and take a picture of that. Oop, that didn't look so pretty. Let's try that again. Get back up a little bit and capture the whole thing. You can see it trying to size it. Okay, that looks better. So the scan function on the OneDrive app, as you notice, it cut off my desk and got rid of the background, and just really brings focus to the document itself, which is very valuable later in the process when we start performing OCR and character recognition on this invoice. So I'll go ahead and submit it. And you notice here when I submit it, it does ask me some certain fields here as far as the invoice number that I could submit or include on the submission. I don't have to have any of these. I could rely on OCR for this process as well, or I could actually just do it as part of the entry. So we'll go ahead and upload that one. Another option is the concept of a check request or a Power App to support a check request. So this is similar idea. It just gives me a little bit more flexibility into the type of fields I could request and the data entry that could be required. I have the vendors coming directly from my ERP application. We'll go ahead and pick a date of the invoice. Maybe specify terms, amount. Here I have some sample fields such as the state, the division. Just an example of different types of metadata about the invoice I could capture. Of course, same idea as before, I'll take a picture of it and then submit it. So all of those are just examples of ways that I'm ultimately starting with that first process of the invoice submission. Now, if I were to go back to my dashboard, again, this is AP person coming in, and I were to look at those that are awaiting preliminary approval, sort by the created date. So I'll look at my newest ones. So here's all the ones that are just coming in since I've been on the phone. And I could see those documents right here are being entered into this review process. In addition, I could capture additional data about these. So here you can see I'm just capturing such things as the from. As these are submitted to OCR, in fact, if I look at this in a different view, such that I could show you additional columns, we're actually capturing a lot of other details here. Such things as the number, the amount. These fields are coming in from various methods. The ones I submitted on the phone, as you noticed, I typed those fields in. So of course, we're capturing that metadata directly from the entry. Ones that come in via email, it was submitted to OCR. And the process of OCR is capturing such things as the invoice number, the amount, other fields that are being automatically recognized from that invoice itself. So depending if it's coming in on a web form, an app, mobile submission, all of those I have the ability to capture some type of metadata from the invoice, which is ultimately going to be used for future processing, maybe the workflow associated to it, maybe something as simple as an account assignment. What type of an account is this going towards? So the way I have my workflow set up or my processing set up is when it comes into this library, I kick off a preliminary approval process. And I'm calling it preliminary because I really haven't brought into the invoice any of the accounting features yet. So this preliminary process, maybe it is applicable to you, maybe it's not. It's just an option for your at your disposal, if you will. So you don't have to have the preliminary approval process. I do. Just really to confirm the outcome of the OCR and just make sure this is a valid vendor, a valid invoice before I proceed any further to bringing it into our application and doing such things as account assignment. So if you notice, if I go to my email here, I now have all kinds of approvals. In addition to my approvals, I see such things as escalations. If I don't act on my approval message, which mine gets escalated within a couple minutes, it escalates it to me such that I get a separate notification that could obviously go to a manager for escalation, etc. So again, I have some detail here of the invoice that it is requesting my review. This is using Microsoft Flow for workflow. So those of you who are familiar with Flow will probably recognize those review tasks. Again, I could look at it or approve or reject it directly from the email. Now, not everyone is using email. Some of us prefer something like Microsoft Teams. If I bring over the Teams application and do a little refresh here on my screen, I will see those approvals all within my Teams app. So here you can see they're being submitted. Here's the one I did from the website. If I were to click on this, same idea. I have some specifics of the invoice and I have the ability to review it. So there's my invoice. And then I can approve, reject it, or reassign it directly from Microsoft Teams. Maybe I don't want to do it from email. I don't want to do it from Teams. Maybe I want to be on the road and do it from my mobile device. Again, I'll drag over my phone. Just again, give it a quick refresh so I can see the latest and greatest. And here you can see I have another invoice coming in via email. And of course I could click on it, view it from here, zoom in, look at the details, and approve or reject it directly from my phone. So all of these are accomplishing the same thing. It's just we're leveraging this Office 365 platform. So we may as well show you all of the options available. So I could do it from Teams, I could do it from email, I could do it from a website. All of those are available for this review and approval of these invoices that are being routed. So back to our dashboard. So from my dashboard, this preliminary approval has been completed. The next step that I have set up in my review is the processing of it. The processing of it is going to get a little bit more detailed because it's going to bring into this picture the financial elements. So today's the 23rd. So you can see here's the one I just created. This is the one that was brought into our application after that preliminary review. Again, preliminary review not required. I'm just performing it for the sake of demonstration. Again, I could see the invoice, of course, got included. The additional elements that are coming into play in this stage are now looking at these allocation items. These allocation items in my demonstration got defined by the template. So I have this allocation template set up for Dynamic Point. That was recognized because I was a submitter on the form or email. It assigned it to the vendor, it assigned it to the company, and then it allocated it to such things as departments and expense types and locations, which are all configurable aspects within our product called categories that ultimately determine GL, or such things as dimension account assignment. So the reason I have this template set up is to minimize the manual assignment that is required. If for some reason something can't be assigned by a template, of course I could go in here and edit these allocations. I could create new allocations, etc. The point of the template is it's nothing more than a default. So maybe it could default such things as the expense type based on the vendor, but then I need to go fill in the department. And all of that is fine as well. So you could edit any component of these after the template has been assigned. The other option is maybe this is a purchase order related invoice. I want to match it to purchase orders in the system. We also have that capability. And what it does is it queries the POs that are within the ERP application, and I could add those line items as well to the invoice. So depending on if it's a miscellaneous invoice in which there's no PO related, or if it's one that's applicable to the purchasing process and the PO is already created, then I could add receipt line items to that to include them. Other thing to know about when it came into the product, I'm going to start capturing such things as the audit. The audit is going to show me the various stages that this invoice is going through from a review and approval perspective. So this is obviously critical to see who submitted the invoice, who's reviewing it, and see a full audit history of the invoice as it goes through the approval. As well as the notes. The notes are the reviewer notes that are being captured. Oops, if I pick one with notes. Well, maybe I don't have any with notes quite yet, but I will shortly because I'm going to review this one. Nope, doesn't look like I have any notes yet. Okay, well, I'll show you a note in a second because I'm going to submit these for review and approval, and during that time frame, I'll be sure to capture some reviewer notes as it's going through the workflow. So I'm going to again kick off a workflow on this. This workflow can be automatically kicked off as well, by the way. So if I trust my templates and they assign everything, I could kick off that workflow in an automated fashion. And now it's going to go through a different review process. So you can see here it's gone under review. This review process is going to be much more financially oriented. So sometimes it takes a second for that to come through. But what I should get here shortly, there it is a new review task. Again, the ability to approve or reject it, but this time when I review it, it's going to be much more of the financial details of that invoice. So as you can see here, I'm not just looking at the document anymore. Of course, that's there, the invoice is there, but I have these other capabilities as well. I have the ability to see the audit, the notes, view the attachment, and then you see also an edit capability. The edit capability is variable depending on whether or not our reviewers have those permissions. So that is something configurable, but maybe I want the reviewer to verify such things as the department, the expense type, the PO match, the other features that we've discussed from an accounting perspective, and change those as it's going through the workflow. So all that is possible as well. So you have really a lot of flexibility there. A user could come in and click it in edit mode. Again, change the account assignment or the department assignment because maybe the reviewer is the person who's determining some portion of that. Maybe they're determining the department or the expense type based on the invoice that has been requested by them if they were the manager who initiated this request with the vendor. So if we go back, again, I'm going to prove it, saying this looks good. We'll submit it. So in my sample, that actually represents the last stage of the workflow. So I have a pretty simple workflow. It's just determined by the department that got assigned. Again, that is being driven by Microsoft Flow. So you can see here the status has gone to approve complete. That means it's pending integration with the ERP application. If I refresh just one more time, I'll see that invoice actually disappeared from my view. Didn't really disappear. I'm just filtering out, but I could see now it's been submitted. Submitted means it has been integrated with the ERP product. It has been created as an invoice for payment. I will have notes now, so just as I mentioned, those did get captured as it went through the review process. And I will have a full audit history of each step of the workflow that got performed and who performed it. Of course, I'm just in as a demo account, so it's my user on all these. That's not that exciting, but in a real environment, it would be going through various managers in the accounting department that would show the user who took action on it. The other critical part about invoice processing is permissions. Who could see this invoice as it's going through the review? So we do assign various groups of users who could have access or maybe have the ability to edit this as it's going through the review process. So we have a whole permissions module to define who has the ability to access that or change the invoice as it's going through the review. And if we were to go back into our dashboard, so that is really it. So if I were to open up the presentation again. So just to recap, the steps that we went through is the submission. In the submission up here, we talked about email. I did some mobile entry. I did a portal request on a website. I did a check request on my phone. All of those went into an Office 365 library. That got submitted to OCR. We are using a cloud-based OCR product that writes all that information right back to the library. So it extrapolates those fields and puts it right back into the library. From there, we put it in our product. We assigned a vendor template for account allocation. We submitted it through Flow for workflow. And upon the last step in the workflow, us updating this as being approved, called the ERP integration and created the invoice in a real-time fashion there. It was a web service call that called the web services and immediately processed that invoice. So like I said, there is a lot of flexibility with this. This setup, just because so much of it is being provided by Office 365. So that's one more slide that I have just to recap. Is if you look at sort of these building blocks, which makes an invoice automation system, there's this various aspects, right? There's the ERP integration, looking up of purchase orders, vendor integration, account, things like that. There's the nature for the invoice repository. Of course, we want to store these, save these, capture metadata about them. There's OCR, capturing the fields, and then there's workflow. For us, most or a large portion of this pie is being provided by that framework, by Office 365. So that gives us the ability to focus on what our key contribution in our intellectual property here is, that integration with the ERP in such things as the allocation templates, the PO match, etc. All the rest of it is being provided by that framework. It is extremely flexible and configurable as far as how many steps in the workflow, the ability to integrate with other systems, the branding of that site, how I want the look and feel of the dashboard to be, OCR, which fields do I want to recognize, am I setting up vendor templates, etc. So we get to focus on what our core competency is really that integration with the ERP product. So that was it from my perspective. I will go ahead and turn it back to Brenda. Brenda, are you still there?
Looks like we had a couple questions come in. So with this remaining time, if you do have a question that you weren't able to ask yet, please enter it using the Q&A panel in your GoToMeeting panel, and we'll answer in the order received. And while those are coming in, I just wanted to note to everyone that yes, this presentation is being recorded. I noted a couple people were having some connection issues or lost audio. If you weren't able to get the full experience or audio visual, then we definitely will be sending out the recording. Looks like we have one question so far. It's regarding the invoice library. Are all the invoices still residing in a SharePoint library? And if so, what is the current library file invoice limit supported by SharePoint?
Great question. So when we bring it into the product, we actually take it out of the preliminary approval library. So the only ones that reside in this are those that have been received. You can think of this as sort of the inbox of invoices. So they're not, quote unquote, being duplicated. There's only, one version of it, if you will. Because when we're ready to bring it into the product and start assigning it categories and things like that, it gets removed from here. To answer your question, off my head, I believe that per Office 365 subscription, you get a terabyte of data. And then I believe every additional user that you sign up for Office 365, I want to say 10 megs or gigs, and I could look that up really quick on what the capacity is there, but it is pretty generous as far as storage. So the options are to set up retention policies such that those invoices are purged out of our product, which again just uses a SharePoint library for storage. Or you could set up a retention policy that moves it somewhere else for archive. So you could use workflow to move it to like a shared drive or to a database or to OneDrive or some other location. But generally speaking, unless the invoices are really gigantic inside, a terabyte will last you quite a long time. So really space is not that much of an issue just because so much comes with an Office 365 subscription. But if it is a problem, then you could set up such things as retention policies to purge them after a given period of time, move them to a new location, or do things like that.
Hopefully that helps answer your question, and please let us know if you have any more that we'd like to cover there. Another one is, can you explain a bit more about the vendor templates?
Sure. So templates, we call them allocation templates. They're not necessarily vendor specific, if you will. And what they do is they serve as defaults for accounting element assignment. So you could create as many of those as you want. And basically what they allow us to do is default any aspect of the accounting assignment, basically by any criteria on the invoice itself. So if I were to go look at my templates really quick. Mine got assigned by my vendor. So I have this auto assignment field. And if I were to expand this, it basically stores different elements of the accounting assignment default. So I have 75% of this invoice going to administration and software, and then it's shared by another department. So what this does is when the invoice is created and received, it applies this template and takes the amount of the invoice. So say it was $100, of course it would put $75 to this line item and $25 to this line item. And what this establishes is basically a template so I don't have to do manual entry every time. But a vendor template is really nothing more than a default. If I have to change it, I most certainly can. Also, if for some reason certain aspects of the accounting assignment are not determined by, in my case, the vendor, like I said, this could easily be project-based or department-based or whatever, then I don't have to fill those out. So say, dynamic point, I know it's a software invoice, but maybe I want to leave the department blank. I can most certainly do that. So when the invoice gets created, the department is blank, and that becomes something that's assigned, either by an administrator, recognized off OCR, or maybe that's determined through the workflow process. So depending on, what aspects can be recognized from OCR or from the invoice submission, what aspects can be determined by such things as the vendor, then I could use the allocation templates to minimize my manual entry. But again, not everything has to be defined on them. And I'm sorry, just to go back to the previous question about storage limits, I did find that article. So it is 1 terabyte plus 10 gigs per license. So generally speaking, it is not a constraint from us for storage just because Microsoft gives us so much to start. But like as I mentioned before, if that is an issue, you can most certainly do things to manage the storage of those invoices, but they give us a lot.
Great.
Mhm.
Regarding tax information, is that able to be captured as well?
Yes, good question. So tax is most certainly something that we could capture. The OCR product could also capture that because it's usually denoted as a separate line item. And then that gets just added on the invoice and then included within the integration. So our product is not serving as the tax engine, if you will. We're not determining tax rates and everything else. It is capturing that and then passing that to the ERP. And then if any calculations as far as which GL account those taxes are being posted to and things like that, that really comes from the ERP application is providing that functionality.
Perfect. And then are the PO receipts matched with invoices automatically, or do they need accounts payable to match them together?
That is a very good question. So the product, as we discussed, has this capability of doing PO matching. And if I have one that comes in on a PO, such as my sample here, I could do a match to items. And the items that it's querying are actually those coming directly from the ERP product. So in that case, I'm doing it in sort of a manual fashion, right? The invoice came in and I'm picking those line items. If OCR could recognize those line items in a consistent basis, then we have the ability to automatically perform that match as part of the invoice processing and by the nature that the line items were recognized from the OCR process. From experience, that's a little difficult because sometimes your vendors are calling items that don't match the items in your system. So getting OCR to pick that up is absolutely possible, but sometimes vendors will call an item, 1, 2, 3, 4. In our system, it's 4, 5, 6, 7. So making that translation becomes a little bit of a challenge. It most certainly is possible from a technical perspective. And if your vendor invoices are, if your vendors are disciplined, I should say, and always denoting those as the correct item, then we could see a lot of success in that. Other times it's a little bit of a challenge just because the vendor invoices are calling things differently, and then a lot of the time is spent in sort of translating what they're denoting as items versus what the items are denoted within our purchase order.
And this one is regarding Dynamics AX. Can invoice costs be split across multiple legal entities?
Ooh, across multiple legal entities, which I'm assuming is going to translate to different companies. So generally speaking, when we integrate an invoice, it is going to one company within Dynamics AX. If that needs to be split between multiple legal entities or companies within AX, the intercompany functionality is usually the way to go. So from our perspective, we're passing that invoice to one entity, and they're the responsible entity that is paying the invoice. But when it comes to the accounting behind it, it's getting allocated behind the scenes using intercompany functionality. So really from our perspective, it's going to one, they're paying it, etc. The other option, when it gets a little bit messy, is that when an invoice comes in, we want to split it. And one portion would go to one entity and one portion would go to the other. Albeit that it's possible, it's just usually that becomes a little bit more messy because now the tracking of those invoices back to our system is no longer this one-to-one relation. So if there's one company that's sort of the paying entity that's paying all these invoices and is responsible for the actual AP process, then you can use intercompany to reflect those expenses to the different entities and then settle them on month end using a like due to and a due from account.
Hopefully that helps answer your question. That looks like all the questions that we had for today. Mike, do you have contact information on a slide? Perhaps if we do have any questions that might come up later, you can also reach out to us via our website at dynamicpoint.com. We have a nice schedule meeting tool that you can use to select a time that works best for you. We're happy to do any one-on-one demonstrations or discuss any specific requirements that you might have.
Yeah, that's probably the best. If you go to Dynamic Point, you have the ability to schedule a call or, of course, contact us here. Contact form will generate an email for us. The scheduled call will put it right on our meeting calendar. So we're happy to set up anytime. If you have any other questions or if you want to set up a live demonstration, we're happy to do that as well.
Thanks everyone for joining, and Mike, thanks for your time today. Again, this
Thank you all so much, and we wish you a great day. Thank you, Brenda, for hosting.